We show you registered as Andrew McVeigh here on behalf of Texans for Fiscal Responsibility Intermutual. Is that correct?
That's correct.
All right, please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members. Thank you for the opportunity to address you today. My name is Andrew McVeigh. I'm here on behalf of Texans for Fiscal Responsibility. I appreciate the expert testimony from the other panelists here. I'm going to be taking a slightly different perspective or approach to this particular question, looking at it from the economic risks and the market risks of this issue, something that's often overlooked, I think. And I want to start with a brief history refresher, something that I think we often lose sight of when we're talking about land ownership. Land ownership has always been deeply intertwined with the American identity. From the earliest days of settlement, land was seen as foundational to liberty, independence, self-determination, and economic opportunity. Colonists and immigrants from all over the world came here in search of a new life more often than not centered around the opportunities and independence that came with owning the ground underneath their feet. That heritage continued into the establishment of the United States, and for many settlers, land was more than just a means of survival, right? It was a path to upward mobility, okay? Access to land ownership was particularly appealing to those who had little or no chance of improving their circumstances in the places from where they immigrated from, right? In a country where social hierarchies and economic systems were less rigid than in Europe or the rest of the world, acquiring land allowed individuals to succeed in ways that would have been impossible for them in the old world. So fundamentally, the concept of the American dream, that phrase came up earlier, took shape with land ownership at its core, all right? The idea that anyone could come to America, work hard, and acquire land to grow their own food, start a business, build a home, and raise a family became a powerful narrative that has attracted and continues to attract immigrants from around the globe. And even today, as our society has shifted dramatically over the last century from a primarily agrarian one to a much more urban one, the point remains. The food we eat, the resources we grow, the homes we build, they're grown and built on land. So at its core, foreign land ownership, particularly hostile foreign entities, threatens that American dream for citizens and those who wish to come here and become American citizens. The increasing presence of foreign entities in the agricultural land market restricts the available supply of land and threatens opportunities for American citizens to own land and thus achieve their American dream. According to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, as of 2012, foreign entities owned approximately 26.1 million acres of U.S. agricultural land. Fast forward just 10 years to the end of 2022, those numbers have increased to roughly 43.5 million acres, nearly doubling. That's nearly the size of the state of Florida that is foreign owned. So foreign ownership is continuing to increase year after year. According to that same 2022 report, the states with the largest percentages of foreign-owned land include Maine at more than 21%, Hawaii in second place with nearly 13%, and then other states, Alabama, Michigan, Louisiana, Nevada, and Florida, each of which have more than 8% of their private ag land owned by foreign entities or individuals. Here in Texas, while our percentage of foreign ownership is not as high, it is continuing to increase, and we have more actual acreage that is foreign-owned than any other state, reaching roughly 5.5 million acres. That's nearly the equivalent size of the state of New Jersey. And those numbers have nearly doubled in the last 10 years. And I want to take just a brief side note here. I believe it was Representative Goodwin earlier that was asking about the reporting requirements of some of these purchases and ownership, and one of the other panelists addressed it. But I wanted to point out that even when it comes to the specific countries that are buying up the land, we've been talking about China a lot today, even the USDA admits that the numbers of acres that these specific countries or entities own could be very much underreported. Holdings are reported under the Form FSA 153 by primary investor. If there's investors from multiple countries, or if an entity has set up a complex structure where investors are coming from several different countries, then they are recorded as no predominant country. And so we kind of run into this issue where with some of these instances, we have the potentiality, I guess, for underreporting and not knowing exactly who is really behind some of these purchases. One major concern, of course, is the impact of foreign ownership on land prices. Foreign investors, often with significant financial resources and deep pockets, can outbid local farmers and ranchers, driving up land prices and making it more difficult for Texans to purchase land. This can have a particularly devastating impact on young farmers, newly naturalized U.S. citizens, and those trying to enter the agricultural industry. Foreign ownership of ag land also raises concerns about control over the food supply, which we've touched on today as well. If foreign entities own significant portions of the land used to produce food, they could potentially influence the availability and price of food in the United States and the world. This is particularly concerning when the foreign owners are from nations that may not have America's best interest at heart. Allowing foreign entities to own large amounts of agricultural land can create economic dependence on those foreign entities. If a significant portion of a state's agricultural industry is controlled by foreign entities, the state could become vulnerable to economic coercion or manipulation by those foreign powers. And of course, when foreign entities own our land, there is a concern that they may not contribute as fully to the tax base as domestic owners, thereby shrinking the tax base even further and placing a higher burden on Texas taxpayers and making issues such as property tax relief even more difficult. So what have other states done? Well, we've touched upon it. The other panelists have touched upon it some. According to the National Agricultural Law Center, to date, roughly 24 states have enacted some type of prohibition or restriction on foreign governments or entities buying real property. One of the most recent examples includes the state of South Dakota, which just 5 months ago in March passed legislation into law prohibiting hostile foreign entities, including China, and their governments from owning South Dakota agricultural land. What about Texas? Unfortunately, Texas has taken little action on this threat, specifically when it comes to agricultural land. TFR recommends that steps are taken to ensure that hostile foreign governments and companies or their proxies cannot buy or control Texas's valuable agricultural land. Legislation should be passed to ensure this. At the same time, we should be looking at what else contributes to the inaffordability of land for Texans in the first place. At the state and local level, property taxes are perhaps the greatest hindrance to property ownership. At a time when inflation, the cost of living, and other economic issues place undue burdens on Texans, property taxes continue to rise with no end in sight. The legislature should take steps to phase out and eliminate property taxes so the Texans can truly own the ground underneath their feet. Now, some have argued, or I've heard it argued, that putting restrictions on foreign land ownership might hurt immigrants. And I would reject that claim. And I would actually argue that it does just the opposite. Why would we allow the foreign governments or their proxies, governments that many of these immigrants are fleeing from in search of a better life, to buy up the land and real property in this state, thereby taking land off the market and making it more difficult for those very same immigrants to come here and live their American dream? Our farming and rural communities are the backbone of our nation and the backbone of the entire world's food supply, but they are also under threat. Instead of Texans being able to harvest their own crops and timber and livestock from their own land, our land itself is being increasingly harvested by foreign entities. The United States, including Texas, is not an economic zone to be used or exploited by foreign nations or companies. Texas land should be available for citizens and those who wish to come here and make this nation their home, not for foreign governments, entities, or individuals whose allegiance is elsewhere. And with that, I appreciate your time, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.